You would have been a footballer.
I had the chance, but I got in with the wrong crowd. Fell in with the wrong people, as it were.
Who were the wrong people then?
Musicians.
Rock history is littered with broken friendships, bitter rivalries, and the kind of secrets that only come to light when the years have taken their toll. Few stories embody that truth more than the complicated, electric relationship between Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck. Together, they reshaped the sound of rock, pairing Beck's incendiary guitar with Stewart's unmistakable raspy voice. But behind the brilliance was conflict, ego, betrayal, and choices that altered both their destinies. Now, at 80, Rod Stewart has finally opened up about what really happened between him and Jeff Beck. The question is, was it respect, resentment, or both? The mid-1960s in Britain was a breeding ground for rock revolution. The Beatles had cracked open the door, and suddenly the entire island seemed alive with amplifiers, sweat-soaked clubs, and guitarists who played as though their very lives depended on it. It was in this environment that two unlikely forces collided. Rod Stewart, the young vocalist with a gravelly tone and scrappy attitude, and Jeff Beck, the guitar prodigy who had just stepped out of the Yardbird's shadow. Rod Stewart wasn't a star yet. He was hustling, singing with blues groups, busking at train stations, and scraping by in a London that didn't always embrace his cocky swagger. But what set him apart was his voice, a raw, ragged howl that carried both desperation and charm. It was the sound of a man who had lived more than his years suggested, who had known rejection, poverty, and the taste of cheap beer in smoky pubs. Jeff Beck, by contrast, was already gaining mythic status. His time in the Yardbirds had proven him to be one of the era's great innovators. His guitar wasn't just an instrument, it was an assault weapon, a storyteller, a force that could be as tender as it was violent. By 1967, Beck was eager to form his own group, to step away from the shadows of Clapton and Page, and to craft something entirely his own. Their meeting was less fate than necessity. Beck needed a voice that could stand up to his guitar, something wild enough to match the chaos he unleashed on stage. Stewart, with his raspy roar, was exactly that. Introduced through mutual contacts in London's music scene, the pairing seemed almost too perfect. Two young men, both hungry, both brash, both unwilling to compromise. When they first jammed together, the chemistry was immediate. Beck's guitar sliced like lightning, and Stewart's voice rode the storm. It wasn't polished, it wasn't refined, but it was alive, dangerously alive. It was blues turned up to 10, soul wrapped in distortion, raw emotion screaming through amplifiers. The Jeff Beck Group was born. Alongside Ron Wood on bass and Mickey Waller on drums, they formed a quartet that would become legendary. Not for longevity, but for the sheer impact of their brief time together. They didn't just play music, they attacked it, reshaped it, forced it into submission. But even in those early days, cracks were visible. Stewart admired Beck's genius, but bristled at his control. Beck saw Stewart's charisma as both an asset and a threat. They were two stars in the making, orbiting each other in a fragile balance. Still, for that moment in time, the revolution had begun. When the Jeff Beck Group first hit the stage, audiences didn't know what hit them. Beck's guitar was ferocious, bending notes into shapes no one had ever heard before, while Rod Stewart's voice cut through like gravel soaked in whiskey. Together, they created a sound that was both primal and transcendent. Their first album, Truth, was nothing short of a bombshell. From the opening track, a blistering cover of Shapes of Things, to their take on Willie Dixon's You Shook Me, the record was a declaration. This wasn't polite British blues. This was raw, heavy, unrelenting. Many music historians now call Truth the blueprint for hard rock, even proto-heavy metal, years before Led Zeppelin would codify the genre. And at the heart of it was the dynamic between Beck and Stewart. Beck's solos were like controlled chaos, unpredictable but devastatingly precise, while Stewart's vocals sounded like a man fighting for his life inside the song. Together, they had alchemy. Critics raved, fans flocked, and suddenly, This scrappy group of musicians found themselves at the forefront of a new movement. But inside the band, the storm was brewing. Beck, brilliant but notoriously mercurial, treated his guitar as both crown and shield. He demanded attention, respect, and, above all, control. Stewart, meanwhile, was no shrinking violet. His personality was as loud as his voice, and his ambition was growing by the day. It didn't take long before friction became inevitable. On stage, the tension added to the performance. Their shows were unpredictable, fiery, often teetering on the edge of collapse. One night, they would be transcendent, the next, shambolic. But to fans, that danger was part of the allure. You didn't go to a Jeff Beck group show to hear perfection. You went to watch lightning try to strike twice. Offstage, the relationship was more complicated. Stewart admired Beck's genius, but often felt like a hired gun rather than a partner. Beck, meanwhile, couldn't understand why Stewart pushed back against his authority. To Beck, the group was his vision. To Stewart, it was his launchpad. Their chemistry was undeniable, but it was also combustible. And as the second album, Beck-Ola, loomed, the cracks began to widen. The Jeff Beck group should have been unstoppable. They had the talent, the swagger, and the critical acclaim. But what they lacked was stability. And in rock and roll, instability can be both magic and poison. In the studio, Beck and Stewart's dynamic was exhilarating but exhausting. Beck demanded perfection, pushing the band through endless takes, chasing a sound only he could hear. Stewart, with his raw, instinctive approach, often clashed with Beck's meticulousness. Where Beck wanted precision, Stewart thrived on imperfection. Their arguments became legendary, shouted battles that left producers and bandmates caught in the crossfire. The second album, Beck-Ola, was heavier, darker, more aggressive. With tracks like All Shook Up and Plinth, Water Down the Drain, the band doubled down on the proto-hard rock sound. Critics hailed it as another milestone, though some noted the chaos creeping into the edges. It was as if the band was burning too brightly, too fast. Touring only amplified the problems. The Jeff Beck group had a reputation for erratic performances. Some nights, they were untouchable, Stewart's voice soaring, Beck's guitar shredding reality itself. Other nights, the egos clashed. The band fell apart on stage, and audiences were left bewildered. The press began to speculate. Was this brilliance worth the dysfunction? Behind the scenes, the chaos was worse. Arguments over money, direction, and credit plagued the group. Stewart felt Beck treated him as replaceable, while Beck suspected Stewart was plotting his escape. Ron Wood, ever the pragmatist, often found himself in the middle, playing peacekeeper. But even his steady presence couldn't stop the inevitable implosion. Yet for all the dysfunction, the glory was undeniable. The Jeff Beck group laid the foundation for hard rock, influencing bands like Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and countless others. Stewart's vocals on Truth and Beck-Ola remain some of his finest performances, raw and unfiltered, a singer discovering his power. Beck's guitar work was revolutionary, redefining what rock could sound like. But brilliance often burns itself out, and as the 1960s drew to a close, so too did the fragile partnership between Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck. The chaos had fueled the glory, but it was also tearing them apart. If the Jeff Beck group sounded like a thunderstorm captured on vinyl, it was because two storms were constantly colliding behind the scenes. Jeff Beck, the perfectionist genius, and Rod Stewart, the instinctive firebrand, could not have been more different in how they approached music or life. And as the band's fame grew, so too did the intensity of their egos. Beck had always been a difficult figure to pin down. Even in the Yardbirds, he clashed with management and bandmates, bristling at compromise. With his own group, he was determined to be the unquestioned leader. In his mind, he had handpicked Stewart as a frontman, not as a partner. Beck wanted total control over direction, set lists, and sound. He saw himself as the architect of the group, but Rod Stewart, barely in his 20s, was beginning to understand his own star power. He wasn't just another singer. Audiences were responding to him, sometimes more than to Beck's guitar wizardry. Stewart's raspy howl, paired with his wild stage presence, gave the group its emotional core. Fans were drawn to his rawness, his danger, his charisma, and that terrified Beck. Their clashes were inevitable. Recording sessions became battlegrounds. Beck would insist on take after take, chasing perfection. Stewart, with his gut-driven style, felt that the rawness was the magic, that too much polish would kill the soul of the song. Arguments could last for hours, with shouting matches echoing through the studio. At one infamous session, Stewart stormed out entirely, only to be coaxed back by Ron Wood, who reminded him that this was their shot at history. On tour, the tension was even more obvious. Beck hated the idea that Stewart might overshadow him. He'd often turn up the guitar mid-performance, determined to reclaim the spotlight. Stewart, in turn, pushed back harder, strutting across the stage, dragging out notes, daring Beck to compete. The audience loved it. The raw, unpredictable energy crackled like electricity. But backstage, it bred resentment. Their egos weren't just artistic, they were personal. Beck, reserved and temperamental, often retreated into himself when angry, while Stewart deflected conflict with humor, bravado, and drinking. They were oil and water, yet somehow their collision produced fire. And while that fire lit up stages and records, it also scorched the bond between them. Looking back, Stewart has admitted that he and Beck were simply too young, too ambitious, and too stubborn to make it last. "We were both cocksure kids," he said in later interviews. "There was no way we could have lasted together. We wanted the same thing, the world, and we weren't going to share it." The price of their ambition was steep. The Jeff Beck Group had the potential to dominate the 1970s, but the clashing egos made longevity impossible. Still, in those few years, they left behind music that would influence generations. But for Stewart and Beck, the glory was overshadowed by what could have been. If only they could have gotten out of each other's way. If the music was volatile, the lifestyle was pure chaos. The Jeff Beck Group embodied the rock and roll cliché: women, whiskey, and wild nights that blurred into mornings. But behind the glamour was a darker reality, one that added to the strain between Stewart and Beck. Rod Stewart was already developing a reputation as a ladies' man. His charm, scruffy good looks, and mischievous grin made him irresistible to fans. After shows, dressing rooms filled with admirers, and Stewart leaned into the attention. Beck, by contrast, was more withdrawn, more interested in his guitar than in chasing women. He watched Stewart's antics with a mix of disdain and jealousy. To Beck, it wasn't professional. To Stewart, it was simply part of the rock and roll package. Alcohol flowed like water. The band lived on a diet of whiskey, beer, and adrenaline. Nights often ended in hotel room parties that stretched until dawn, instruments forgotten in favor of excess. Stewart thrived in the chaos, joking, singing, sometimes stumbling into the next day's rehearsal still half drunk. Beck, however, grew increasingly frustrated. He felt the indulgence was undermining the music, that Stewart's carefree attitude cheapened the seriousness of what he was trying to build. The contrast between them: Beck's guitar was discipline, craft, precision. Stewart's voice was instinct, spontaneity, abandon. On stage, this tension was magic. Off stage, it was misery. Arguments erupted not only about music, but about lifestyle. Stewart mocked Beck's intensity. Beck derided Stewart's recklessness. The rest of the band often played referee, but even Ron Wood admitted years later, "We all knew it was only a matter of time before it blew up." There were also whispers of betrayal. Some insiders claimed Stewart used the Jeff Beck Group as a stepping stone, already planning his escape, while Beck believed they were building something lasting. Stewart's growing popularity with fans and critics only fueled Beck's paranoia. Was Rod preparing to leave him behind? The late-night whispers, the separate social circles, the private meetings with managers, everything fed the suspicion. The wild nights weren't just indulgence. They were distractions from the cracks widening beneath the band. Each party masked a truth. They were drifting apart, even as their music drew them together. For Stewart, the chaos was part of the fun. For Beck, it was proof that the dream was slipping away. By 1969, the Jeff Beck Group was teetering on collapse. The tensions that had fueled their brilliance were now eating them alive. Arguments turned bitter, resentment hardened into silence, and the dream of conquering the world together was slipping away. The breaking point came with opportunity. The group was scheduled to play Woodstock, the defining festival of their generation. It was a chance to cement their legacy alongside Hendrix, The Who, and Janis Joplin. But at the last moment, the Jeff Beck Group pulled out. The official story was illness, but insiders knew the truth. They were simply too fractured to hold it together. Beck and Stewart were barely speaking. Rehearsals dissolved into shouting matches. The chaos that once thrilled audiences now threatened to humiliate them on the biggest stage imaginable. After Woodstock, the writing was on the wall. Beck, frustrated and disillusioned, decided to dissolve the band. Stewart, though disappointed, wasn't devastated. By then, he and Ron Wood had already been eyeing new opportunities. Within months, both would join faces, launching the next chapter of their careers. The breakup shocked fans and left the industry buzzing with rumors. Some blamed Beck's temper, others Stewart's ambition. The truth, as Stewart later admitted, was simpler. We were brilliant together, but we couldn't last. It was like holding a firecracker in your hand. It was bound to explode. The loss was monumental. The Jeff Beck Group had pioneered a sound that bridged blues and hard rock, influencing Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and countless others. Had they stayed together, they might have ruled the 1970s. Instead, they became a cautionary tale, a flash of brilliance extinguished too soon. For Beck, the breakup was a wound that lingered. He struggled to replicate the magic, drifting through projects, chasing perfection. For Stewart, it was liberation. His career with Faces would catapult him to stardom, and soon he would emerge as one of rock's most enduring solo artists. But the shadow of Jeff Beck never left him. Even as Stewart climbed the charts with hits like Maggie May, he knew the question lingered. What if? What if he and Beck had managed to survive each other? What if they had faced Woodstock together instead of falling apart? The music had stopped, but the echoes of their brief, volatile partnership would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. When the Jeff Beck Group collapsed in 1969, many assumed Rod Stewart would fade into the background as just another singer swallowed up by the chaos of the rock scene. But Stewart had other plans. The very qualities that frustrated Beck, his charisma, his unpredictability, his refusal to be controlled, became the rocket fuel for his solo career. Within just a few years, Rod Stewart would become one of the biggest names in rock. Yet even as he rose, the ghost of Jeff Beck followed him. After leaving Beck's group, Stewart joined Faces alongside Ron Wood. Faces were messy, rowdy, and often drunk on stage, but that was their charm. They were the antithesis of polished rock. They were raw energy, camaraderie, and chaos personified. And Stewart thrived. His raspy, soulful voice gave the band its edge, and his stage presence made them unforgettable. Songs like Stay With Me became anthems of the early 1970s, and Stewart's reputation as both a hellraiser and a heartthrob grew. But Stewart wasn't just a band singer anymore. He was carving his own identity. His first solo albums, An Old Raincoat Won't Ever Let You Down and Gasoline Alley, hinted at his potential. Then came Every Picture Tells a Story. With the smash hit Maggie May, Stewart exploded into superstardom. Suddenly, he wasn't just the scrappy lad from North London. He was an international sensation. His face was on magazine covers, his songs dominated the charts, and his concerts drew thousands. Yet behind the success was the shadow of Jeff Beck. Critics couldn't help but draw comparisons. Stewart's gritty voice and rock swagger were often linked back to the raw energy of the Jeff Beck Group. Some said Beck had been the genius who launched Stewart's career, that without him, Stewart would have never found his footing. Others argued that Stewart had stolen Beck's spotlight, abandoning him when the ride got bumpy. The tension between those narratives haunted Stewart. Privately, he admitted to mixed feelings. On one hand, he knew his partnership with Beck had been essential in shaping his sound. On the other, he bristled at the idea that his success was owed to anyone but himself. Stewart wanted to be recognized as his own man, not just the singer who once fronted Jeff Beck's band. Meanwhile, Beck's career, though still respected, never reached the same commercial heights. His endless pursuit of musical perfection meant he often alienated the mainstream. For Stewart, this contrast was both a blessing and a burden. He had the fame Beck never achieved, but he also knew some saw him as the sellout who left artistry behind for popularity. As the 1970s rolled on, Stewart leaned into his role as a superstar. His hits, You Wear It Well, Tonight's the Night, Hot Legs, cemented his reputation. He cultivated his image as a playboy, a lover of fast cars, glamorous women, and wild nights. But in quiet moments, the thought of Jeff Beck lingered. The man who had first given him the stage was now watching from the sidelines, and the rivalry, spoken or not, remained alive. Rod Stewart had risen to the top, but the question gnawed at him. Had he done so by stepping over the very man who helped him get there? The 1970s and 1980s saw Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck walking parallel paths, sometimes intersecting, often diverging, but always aware of each other. Their relationship was complicated, defined by both admiration and resentment. For Stewart, Beck represented unfinished business. He knew his early career was built on their partnership, and he often praised Beck publicly as a genius guitarist. But behind closed doors, the relationship was less cordial. Stewart resented Beck's constant insinuation that he had abandoned artistry for fame. Beck, in turn, resented Stewart's global success, convinced that his former frontman had cashed in on a formula that the Jeff Beck group had pioneered together. There were occasional reunions, but they were fraught. When the two crossed paths at festivals or charity gigs, the encounters were polite but stiff. Stewart would joke about their old days. Beck would smile tightly, never quite letting his guard down. The unspoken history hung between them like smoke that never cleared. Their rivalry was amplified by the press. Journalists loved to pit them against each other. Beck, the tortured genius, versus Stewart, the glamorous superstar. Each interview seemed to rekindle old wounds. Stewart would roll his eyes at questions about Beck, insisting he had nothing but respect. Beck, on the other hand, sometimes let bitterness slip, hinting that Stewart had gone Hollywood. But the resentment wasn't just artistic. Stewart's playboy lifestyle and tabloid fame made him a global celebrity, while Beck remained a cult figure. Beck's refusal to compromise meant he never reached Stewart's level of commercial success, and though he insisted he didn't care, those close to him knew otherwise. Watching Stewart sell out stadiums while he played to smaller, more devoted crowds stung deeply. Yet for all their differences, there was still a strange bond between them. Beck never denied Stewart's talent, often admitting he had one of the greatest voices in rock. Stewart, in turn, acknowledged that Beck's guitar had pushed him to be better. Their rivalry was less hatred than a wound that never healed, a reminder of what might have been if they had found a way to coexist. By the 1990s, time had softened the edges. Both men were older, wiser, and less consumed by ego. Still, the bitterness lingered. When Beck was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in 2009, Stewart offered praise, but the media noted the careful phrasing, the faint edge. Even in celebration, the rivalry cast its shadow. The truth was simple. Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck were bound together by history, admiration, and resentment. They could never escape each other's orbit. And as the years passed, Stewart began to realize that the silence between them was a burden he could no longer carry. At 80 years old, with decades of fame, fortune, and reflection behind him, Rod Stewart finally broke the silence. In a candid interview, he spoke openly about his relationship with Jeff Beck, confirming long-held rumors and dispelling myths that had lingered for half a century. Stewart admitted what fans had long suspected, that the partnership was doomed from the start. We were too young, too headstrong, he confessed. Jeff wanted control. I wanted freedom. We were brilliant together, but we couldn't last. He acknowledged Beck's genius without hesitation. He was the greatest guitarist I ever worked with, Stewart said. No one could touch him. Playing alongside him pushed me further than I thought I could go. But then came the confession that stunned fans. Stewart admitted he sometimes felt guilty for leaving Beck behind. I know people said I used him as a stepping stone, he said softly, and maybe they're right. I wanted more, and I wasn't willing to wait. That decision gave me my career, but it also broke something between us that was never fixed. Stewart also revealed the personal strain between them. Jeff thought I was too flashy, too interested in the limelight. He wasn't wrong. I loved the fame, the attention, but I also think he resented me for it, and I resented him for making me feel like I wasn't serious enough. Perhaps the most poignant moment was when Stewart spoke about Beck's passing in 2023. His voice cracked as he admitted, "I never got to tell him properly how much he meant to me. I thought we had time, but time ran out." That's the thing about pride. You think you can fix things later, and then it's too late. At 80, Stewart's words were less about scandal and more about regret. He confirmed the rumors of rivalry, admitted the fractures, and laid bare the truth. He loved Jeff Beck, admired him, and envied him, but their egos had kept them apart. "We could have made history together," Stewart said. "We did, in a way, but we could have done more." It was a confession that reframed their story, not as enemies, but as brothers in arms who let pride get in the way of greatness. Rod Stewart's confession at 80 does more than settle old questions about his relationship with Jeff Beck. It shines a light on the very nature of rock's golden age. Their story is not unique. It echoes through the histories of countless bands torn apart by ego, ambition, and the relentless grind of fame. In the 1960s and 1970s, rock and roll was a battlefield. It was a time when young men, barely out of their teens, were thrust into the spotlight, handed fame, fortune, and temptation without a rulebook. Stewart and Beck embodied that chaos. They were brilliant, reckless, and unprepared for the weight of their own potential. Their partnership shows how genius and conflict often walk hand in hand. Beck's guitar and Stewart's voice created a sound that helped shape hard rock. Yet the very qualities that made them great also tore them apart. Ego wasn't just a flaw, it was fuel. Without it, they might never have burned so brightly. With it, they couldn't last. Stewart's admission also highlights the tragedy of pride. Decades were lost to silence and rivalry, decades when they could have collaborated again, healed old wounds, and reminded the world of their magic. Instead, the opportunity vanished, leaving only regret. It is a reminder that in rock, as in life, the cost of pride can be immeasurable. But their story also underscores the resilience of music. Though their partnership was brief, its impact was lasting. Bands like Led Zeppelin, Aerosmith, and countless others owe a debt to the Jeff Beck Group. Stewart went on to superstardom, Beck to legendary status among guitarists, but together they created a legacy that endures. At 80, Stewart's words close the chapter with honesty. He confirms the rumors, admits the mistakes, and honors the man he once clashed with. The story of Rod Stewart and Jeff Beck is not just about rivalry. It's about the fragility of human connection in the face of ambition. And in the end, perhaps that is rock's greatest truth. The music outlives the men, but the men carry the scars forever. Rod Stewart's confession at 80 reveals not just the truth about Jeff Beck, but the cost of pride, ambition, and silence. Their story is both triumph and tragedy, a reminder that music may endure, but time does not. What do you think? Was their rivalry worth the legacy it left?